Welcome to the CSM Music and Technology lecture series. This is our second year. Last year we were able to bring 4 audio experts to CSM, 1 through Zoom and 3 in person. We're happy to continue in person with our second year. And we're hoping to also bring 4 audio experts this academic year. And before we get started, I just want to thank CSM as well as the Strong Workforce Program and the Perkins Grant for sponsoring this lecture series. We're going to start off our series this academic year with a presentation by Darren Gibbs, musician and audio software engineer. Darren, like many of us, came to this field, world, career through a love of music, starting, I think, with electric guitar way back as a teenager, and then a love of computers with those really early Apple bricks of computers. And then has kind of woven those together, both in a passion as an artist and also as a professional in the career of music and technology. I met Darren at Mills College. We were both in graduate school at the electronic music and recording media program. And I'm not really sure what that has to do with gamelan music, but that's how we met, was in a gamelan class, which is it was a Javanese percussion class taught on an American-made gamelan by composer Lou Harrison and Bill Colvig, who actually created a lot of the instruments. And so we met there and had an interest there, but we also had an interest in computers, and at both at the time were studying this now archaic computer music programming language called HSML, hierarchical musical specification language, yes, HMSL. And we were both interested in interactive computer music. It was one of the few programs that was developing in that direction. And, you know, at the best, you could call my code spaghetti code. It kind of wandered here and there and all over the place, but it usually more or less worked. Whereas Darren's was always incredibly efficient, clever, elegant, and creative. And you could find all of those things also in his music. And the way that Darren's been able to weave his musical interests and his career and more commercial music projects, and they all have this creative element, is always one of the things I really admire about his work. So without further ado, I'll let him get into all the specifics. I'd like to introduce Darren Gibbs.
Okay, I'm a lot taller than Chris. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. It's super beautiful outside, so I appreciate you coming here to listen to me and my meandering story, hopefully interesting and entertaining about my work life and school life. As Chris said, I started, here we go, 1984. I was playing electric guitar and a couple of bands and just getting to the point where we were playing in clubs and things, and getting, you know, it could have become possibly a career. And on the other side was this interest with technology. In my senior year of high school, the Apple II, they had a lab at our high school, and I started playing around with programming, and it was really fun and basic to draw lines and make beepy noises, and something about it really appealed to me. And I kept thinking there should be a way to combine these things, but I wasn't sure what it was. I just knew I was interested in both. And when I got out of high school, I knew I didn't want to live in Virginia anymore. So I hit the road and ended up in Memphis. My mother lived there, and after a semester of working, I thought I'm going to wait for college. But working at Federal Express doing data entry for a few months cured me of that idea. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go back to school. And there's this really sweet Presbyterian liberal arts college in Memphis. And they had... I found myself kind of doing the same thing again. I was studying classical guitar and programming these giant room-sized computers that they had back in those days. And trying to figure out how I could continue to combine these things. And the school kept wanting me to do one or the other, right? So pick a major, or make your own major, or like you can't just do both willy-nilly. You got to jump through the hoops in the order that we've come up with. And so I read this book, Gödel Bach, and it contained really interesting ideas about music and consciousness and mathematics and art and weaving them together. And it was also about artificial intelligence. And so I had this idea, maybe I'll create my own degree in artificial intelligence. And I started down that path and realized that it was getting way too techy, and I was losing the creative and musical element. And so that semester, this article came out, I think it was in Time, called 9 Nifty Colleges. And that year, one of the nifty colleges was Rhodes, where I was in Memphis, and the other one was this kind of obscure hippie college in Olympia, Washington, called the Evergreen State College. And when I read the blurb, I thought, that sounds way niftier than where I am. And so I picked up and moved to Washington State, which was an interesting callback, because I'm going to find these things repeatedly in my presentation about people and events that keep recurring. In the 4th grade, I had to pick a state to write a report on, and it was Washington. And I remembered writing my letter to Olympia, to the Chamber of Commerce, to get information. And then I ended up living there. And it's interesting synchronicity or coincidence or something. But at Evergreen, you don't have any hoops to jump through, really. You can create your own curriculum. You can study what you want. If you can get other students together and find a faculty to sponsor you, you can study whatever you want and then proceed more and more specifically. So as Chris mentioned, I discovered HMSL there. One of my professors, there was a student a couple of years before me that had gone to Mills and started studying HMSL, and it was super fun because I could make strange music and do programming at the same time. And so you can see what Macintoshes looked like back then and how fancy the graphics were. Not super impressive, but for 1989, it was interesting. And the thing that caught my interest, that combined them, was reading this book about chaos and how chaos theory is both mathematical and potentially musical. It shows up, I have some pictures here, Mandelbrot set. These patterns are very simple mathematical expressions that generate super complex patterns. So there's some vegetables, some snowflakes, things like all of these are fractals. And so I started working with how can I make sound or make music with chaos theory? Because the idea is you're generating something that's similar but not exactly the same, kind of the way like every blues song is similar, but they're not all identical. And so it was a way to get out of either completely through composing something or generating completely randomly, because randomness gets kind of boring. Anyway, that led me to going to Mills, because that's where HMSL was. A friend of mine was studying Buddhism at San Francisco and in Carmel. And one summer he invited me down to come visit. And I thought, well, I'm going to be in the neighborhood. I'll go check out Mills. And I went to the graduate office, and they were so nice. And they said, well, you should come here. It's perfect. Here's the paperwork. Just fill this out and show up, and it's all done. And kind of magically, I didn't even really intend to do it, but I ended up there. So I have, as Chris mentioned, there's gamelan going on, playing with Lou Harrison and Jody Diamond, and playing lots of experimental music with visiting guest artists and with the other students. A nice picture of the concert hall there. Well, that was about 2 years, and I continued to work with chaos theory idea and ended up doing my thesis on synthesis using chaos theory. And so at the same time, I was working in the academic computing and got to spend a lot of time with Next computers. So in addition to all the music and improvisation, there was this other side of learning about Unix and studying programming in more detail, I guess I would say. And so coming up on the end of that time, I was starting to try to figure out, what do I want to do next? Like, I'm not going to get a PhD. I want to make something out of these two interests. I have a short tangent here about the Amiga. HMSL ran on the Amiga, and these two guys, Dave Needle and RJ Michael, were two of the inventors. And through an interesting confluence of events, my thesis advisor was an Amiga nerd, and he wrote HMSL. And these guys started a company called 3DO, which brings me into the world of video games and my first job. So they were looking for someone to do audio. And since I had just come out of an electronic music program, it seemed like it could be a fun thing to work on. They were building a new machine from scratch. Like the PlayStation didn't exist yet, so a CD-ROM based game machine was kind of a new thing. It turned out to be, well, when I should say, when I started my time at Mills, my dad was like, what are you going to do with a degree in electronic music? You're going to be pumping gas when you're done. And during the 2 years I was there, the multimedia industry kind of came up out of nowhere. And so my first job out of school was making more money than him, so I went, I did audio DSP a little bit there, worked on streaming audio off of CD-ROMs and making audio for games. And it was really stressful, really exciting. Also like 12 and 14 and 16-hour days and deadlines for trade shows and people investing hundreds of millions of dollars in this idea, and we were trying to get it out to make it a viable business. And it wasn't really happening. It sort of went into this low Earth orbit kind of situation where it kept not being successful and not dying either. And I burnt out and decided I wanted to go out on my own and do something else. So I became a contractor and thought, I'll be self-employed and try this whole world. And one of the things I worked on was this also not successful game player called the Apple Pippin. Probably none of you even knew it existed. It was basically a Macintosh packaged as a game system with a CD-ROM player. And the main reason I got the job is because I've been doing fourth in HMSL programming. And these machines, all the Macs that were coming out at that time and Sun workstations, all had fourth compilers built into them. And so, strangely, this obscure language that was invented for controlling telescopes in the 70s that I used in grad school to make music became a mainstream thing in the low-level firmware of computers. And so it got me this gig. I have a kind of a funny diagram about how that all works. So I'm going to skip those details for now. And then after a couple of years of doing various contracting jobs, helping people with their Macintosh, like being a sort of IT person, I got this job at Purple Moon doing audio and technology for a game for games for girls. This project came out of interval research, and this very charismatic and brilliant woman, Brenda Laurel, had this idea of why aren't girls as interested in video games as boys, and can we study that and figure out how to make a game world that would be fun for girls? And so we did that. It was funded by Paul Allen, the partner of Bill Gates and Microsoft, and he threw money at it, and it was just getting successful, and then he decided he was bored with it and stopped it, and the whole thing tanked. Which is a recurring theme in startup and technology world, where you put all your blood, sweat, tears, heart, and soul into some project, and people love it, and we just want it to happen, and it doesn't. So after that, I kind of was trying to figure out what to do, and because I'd worked at Apple on that Pippin project, out of the blue, somebody called me one day and said, "We have your resume, and would you be interested in technical writing?" And I thought, I'm kind of burnt out on programming, and it would be fun to work at Apple. I've never worked at a big company. What would it be like? And they made it so easy that I just sort of said, okay, well, why not? And I ended up writing this book about the Cocoa framework. This was right when Apple was devouring Next. So I think my experience on the Next machines at Mills also made it make sense for me to work with them, because they were trying to figure out what to do with Next technology and integrate it into the Apple world. So I was there for a couple of years, and it was cushy, and it paid well, and I thought, it's Apple, and I would see Steve Jobs walking through the cafeteria and think, this is a really awesome place to be. But I noticed as I was driving to work, I was starting to daydream about, what if I just keep driving till I get to Mexico? Writing technical documentation was just really not fun. It was sort of like coming up with the diagrams and figuring out how to explain things, and being a teacher was fun, but my attention span apparently was not long enough. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is sort of the alchemy of career, because at different times in your life, you really have different priorities and what's important to you. Like, is it your quality of life right now? Do I need health insurance now? Do I want to think about retirement? During these 2 years while I was at Apple, my stepfather died from cancer, and he had spent his whole life delaying, to a degree, like delaying his satisfaction and setting up all his ducks in a row. And like, when I retire, I'm going to do everything I want to do. And he retired and got cancer and died that year. And I thought, I don't want that to happen to me. So I'm going to sell all my Apple stock and take a year off and do whatever I want and just have a good time. Ironically, if I had kept that Apple stock, it would now be worth like $9 million and I'd be retired. But that's not the choice I made. So be careful. On the art front during this period, I was working with a friend who I met at Mills, who I worked with at 3DO. He has an electronic art collective called Plasm, and they were doing early electronic art all through the late 80s and 90s and 2000s, a lot of it interactive. And he was working for Silicon Graphics, which probably nobody here has heard of, which was the money is no object, best graphics. One person, awesome. So we had very fancy, awesome computers with great graphics, and what we made was this gigantic rope swing. And the idea was I did a 4-channel sound installation of water, and there was a video projector that projected water, and there was a tracking system for the swing. So as you swung around the water, it would leave a trail of flowers behind you. It was really nice. We took it to, I forgot the name of the conference, in New Orleans in 2000, and it was the way that the strange things that the sound did as you were swinging around in there and seeing the patterns behind you. It was a really cool piece. So that was one of the things that came out of that year off. Also, I worked with a dancer to do music and kind of strange technology. We had both read this book called Art and Physics about how discoveries in physics and art tends to prefigure science. Like, artists start painting things that then become scientific discoveries. This is his thesis. So I made this box that you can see that breaks wine glasses with sound, which was a really fun demo. And a big pendulum. I was using EL wire, which was super hip at the time. And I had another thing that I didn't find a picture of that does Chladni figures, where you put sand on a metal plate, and when you vibrate it, it makes patterns. So you can basically do kind of graphics with sound and physics. So that was most of that year that I took off, was working on bits of this. And then I met this guy Kirby and Randall. Randall was a lighting designer and worked at the Exploratorium, and Kirby on the right there, he had a business selling very large quartz crystals, and they wanted to come up with a system for lighting them. And they were having some problems with the technology, and they asked me if I would want to work on it with them. And that was my, you can see this box here on the right, on the left on your side is the light labyrinth, we called it. It does strobing lights and fading lights, and it can visualize music, so you can play music into it, and the lights will track the spectrum of the music. We got into brainwave theory and started making strobing patterns that would do entrainment with your brain waves and bring you into meditative states if you were lucky. And so it got a lot of interest, got to kind of cross in this one project. Career-wise, I was self-employed, and the thing that I learned from this was about PIC chips, microcontrollers. So I had not really ever heard of them. They were invented in 1975, but basically it's taking what we think of as a whole computer and putting it into one chip, a very reduced version of it. And so they're in many shapes and sizes, and they all share this like computer plus memory plus a way of communicating with the outside world, sampling signals, could be audio, could be motion, and controlling things on the outside world. So now they're everywhere. They're all over your car, they're in your washing machine, everything up here and more has microcontrollers in it. And so through this Light Labyrinth project, I got real familiar with programming PIC chips and then Atmel AVR chips. And it was really interesting, and it turned out to become another recurring theme of projects that involve microcontrollers. Now there's Arduino, So I'm probably, at least more than one of you has heard of an Arduino. That whole physical computing world came out of the popularization of microcontrollers and trying to do, they were trying to build something that would make it easy for artists, because before Arduino, it was pretty nerdy. If you were an artist, you had to really want to go down the nerd path to be able to do anything with the microcontrollers. So I worked with Kirby on and on. We did that project for like 10 years, and I would work on other things and come back to it, and work on other things and come back to it. And then I started to think about what's really next. And that's when my friend Peter, who is a teacher at the Evergreen State College in Washington, basically called me up and said, hey, we have a job, and I think you'd be great at it. It's running the multimedia lab at the school. You would teach Final Cut Pro video editing and do some whatever classes you want. So I decided, I'd always wondered if I would prefer living up in the woods to being in the Bay Area indefinitely. And so this was a perfect opportunity to go try it out. So I moved up there, and we had all this fancy equipment in the lab. And I taught some courses on Max MSP and physical computing and Arduino. That year was about when Arduino came out, 2005. And I heard about it online. I was like, I'm going to order one of these things and see what to do with it. And that turned into this sound sculpture, architectural extravaganza I called Benevolent Haunting. We were in a 4-story building, and there was this 4-layer stairwell that had all of these metal pieces. And when the kids would walk through, they were always kind of making sound on them. And I thought, something about it was like, oh, man, I can do something with this. And I heard it every day because my office was right next to the stairwell. So maybe I'll make something fun with it. So I came up with this idea that I would order a whole bunch of solenoids, which are electrically driven, like little pistons. And so I attached solenoids and some speakers, and in different places I put sensors on certain stairs. So there was like an ultrasonic sensor, and if you stepped on it, the microcontroller would read it and send it to a Max MSP patch, and it would control these solenoids and motors, and they would play kind of gestures or melodies on the metal of the stairwell. And so it made climbing up and down the stairwell really fun. The students liked it. I had 2 seniors who worked on it with me as part of their school project, so we learned Arduino and figured out how to drive solenoids and motors and did all the stuff. Here's some more pictures. You can see the tiny speakers. I had some sounds that I played back from Max. And there was a little motor that spun that had like a chain on it that would rub against the metal. There's a lot of beauty. I wish I still had the video. I know it's somewhere, but I couldn't find it in time for the talk. Here's the monstrosity of electronics that I built for it. The 2 Arduinos in the middle and a power supply and a whole bunch of solenoid driving circuits. I still have that somewhere in the garage. So what happened? I was there a year, 2005 to 2006, and Evergreen is awesome, and it was interesting to go back as a teacher rather than a student after some years. It was also the rainiest winter in 40 years. I think it rained for 118 days straight, and by the spring, I was kind of wanting to throw myself out a window. Being at the school was fun, and working with the students was fun. Teaching video editing, like beginning video editing over and over and over again, stopped being fun for me. And I was having a long-distance relationship with somebody in the Bay Area, and it all kind of built up to, I don't think I can do this. I'm going to go back to California. So I pulled up my stakes and got back in the car and came back to Oakland. And then what happened next? LeapFrog. So I don't remember how I got involved in LeapFrog. I knew somebody who said, hey, we're doing this thing. You should come work on it. It'll be really fun. They had been split geographically between a sort of tech group in Palo Alto, as I recall, and the sort of marketing and educational people in Emeryville, and they decided it was too expensive to keep them separate, and so they tried to move everybody to Emeryville, and a lot of people rebelled and didn't want to do the commute, and so they quit, and so that was an opportunity for me. So we worked on this called a Didj, a strange name for a handheld gaming device. But it was fun. I worked on the audio part of it, and my friend Phil, who was my advisor, who wrote HMSL, who got me into 3DO, also worked on the audio for this, so more recurring characters. And we did it, there was a choice between should we do this with Microsoft Windows stuff or with Linux? And I convinced people we should use embedded Linux. So back in 2005, I first got exposed to that. And it worked. It was cool. I don't think it was particularly commercially successful, but the company was having a lot of problems at the time. And once again, got bought out by their biggest competitor, and it all ended. And then I was back looking for something to do when a friend from Mills said, I've been working with Don Buchla for years and years and years, and we need somebody to do some microcontroller work. And so music and MIDI and microcontrollers, and I didn't really know that much about Don. I knew that he had, invented analog modular synthesizers in the 60s along with Bob Moog, and that vibe was going on then. And he's a peculiar and interesting character. We got along, and so for almost 10 years, I worked with him on a bunch of different instruments. So the Lightning, has anybody heard of the Lightning 3 or seen one? It's kind of like the Wii, but many years before the Wii. They were light-based controllers. So basically, you could play percussion in the air, and it was a MIDI controller, so you could play sounds. There's a really cool piece that I didn't get the video for, where Joel is playing percussion on stage, and somebody comes and one by one takes all the instruments away, and he's actually playing in the air, and all the sounds are samples. It's a pretty awesome, dramatic demo. So here is, at Evergreen, they had a Buchla system, so this is how I was familiar with it. My mentor, teacher, friend, Peter, there pointing the way for students. Mills had one of the very first ones because this whole thing was tied up with San Francisco Tape Music Center, which is what became the Mills College Center for Contemporary Music. So there's an old Buchla that I played with a few times there. I worked mostly on this version, which is the 200E. It was like a revival of the old 200 series with presets and more storable configuration. And it was fun designing, seeing the process of how Don designed stuff on paper. Then in Illustrator, he designed the interface, decided how much it would cost before he had even designed the electronics. Then building the thing, getting the first prototypes, getting the sort of basics of the idea working, and seeing how you iterate through building something and making a product that then ships out. So I worked on a bunch of different modules, on the way that the modules communicate with each other behind the scenes. I worked on the easel, which we ended up designing this Arduino-based preset card because there was no storable presets for the easel. And it used Wi-Fi, so there was an iPad app that you could draw on, and it would you could save your presets in this card and then recall them during performance. So that was a really fun, crazy project. Here's a picture of it with the power on. The thing that I enjoyed most, I think, is this module, which is a circular sequencer. It started out with Don's idea of a circular metronome and polyrhythms, and so there were concentric circles, like 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, all the way out to 16, and you could define sequences. So for each cell in there, you could have a control voltage and a trigger, 3 different control voltages. So I worked on this and ended up kind of co-designing it at a certain point. This was sort of the last big project before Don retired and the company got sold to some Australians. A sad story that I won't go into, but the instrument was really cool. And I have here, I believe, a video. Oh, there it is. I had studied tabla before, and I liked the sounds that I could get that were sort of tabla-like, and so I improvised this on the 252. it was really fun to make something that you could pre-compose sequences in and explore polyrhythms, and also it was playable enough that you could use it like an instrument and make stuff in real time. I liked how that came out. So during this same time, on the more art front, I made friends with a percussionist, Laura and Sarah, who played the hung, and we started improvising together and ended up recording 2 CDs, 2009, Musical Incense. When I was at Evergreen, I started working with looping, and I wrote my own crazy multi-channel looper for guitar, and I used it for this whole project. And I still have, like 20 years later, it's still working. Every time Max comes out, I update it and make it keep working. So you can still get those on Amazon. I was also playing gamelan at this point. Sekar Jaya is a Balinese music and art and dance group in Berkeley, and got pretty deep into that, where I was going a couple times a week. We went to Bali several times and studied there. We did a tour in Bali. It's a nice antidote to tech. If you're doing something electrical all day, to have bamboo and wood and bronze and no electricity is a really nice thing to do to balance it. Around this time, I also started playing around with iOS apps. So Brenda, who's here, had this idea for what we called sound drawing. And so I kind of learned how to make an iPad app and the basics. It was a lot easier then than it is now. We made this, what do I want to say about it? You basically map sound, put sounds on the surface and draw on it, and as what you drew plays back, it plays the sound along with it. So it combines the gestures of drawing and sound at the same time. It was really cool. Also during this period, I was studying Chinese medicine and Chinese astrology really intently, and decided to make an app for astrology. So on the left, there's a phone app for the Tongshu, it's called. It's like a, what's the word I'm looking for? Farmer's almanac, kind of like an almanac. It's very, very old in China, and it's good for following the cycles of the calendar, and for every day there's suggested when it's good to expend a lot of energy and when it's good to rest, and what things to do and what not to do. So I made it into an app, which was really fun, a fun way to study it. And the same with, Tongshu? Tongshu, T-O-N-G-S-H-U. Now there's a bunch of Tongshu apps in the iOS App Store. There didn't used to be. And I made one for natal astrology. It's called Polestar. And it lets you generate charts, and it's a lot of astrologers in that world are using it now. So let's see, what's next? When I was in Bali, I got a call from a friend who I'd worked with at Buchla, who said, I used to work for Line6, and they have this project, and I think you'd be good for that. And so it was another, like, out of the blue, change your life sort of story. I ended up going and working with Line6 on this Helix guitar processor for a year, working on the firmware update stuff and some of the drawing and basic user interface. This thing was a big success for it. It was one of the first ones after all these years of things tanking that were super cool, or the Buchla stuff, which kind of creaked along and not a huge success. This thing, they sold a lot of them. There's a floor version, and there's also a rack mount version for studios. It does amp modeling and signal processing. Like every kind of stomp box you've ever heard of or seen is stuck in there, so you can make bajillions of different sounds. And that was really fun. It was a bit stressful. Their whole team had quit, and then they hired a bunch of new people, and we were all trying to figure out what the previous people did and the deadline and the stress. And after a year of that, I decided I wanted to do something else, and that's when I heard about Keith McMillan Instruments. Keith was looking for someone to work on this thing he called a sustainer. So it's basically a way to sustain the notes on the guitar mechanically. So in the bridge on the saddle pieces, he had little piezo devices, and so the pickups would feed back into the saddle and vibrate the string, so you could play a note and it would ring indefinitely. And you could control the gain and the length of time. And so I worked on that at KM. I have a video. Let's see if I can play that. Where's the cursor?
a string and notes legato, just like a piano sustained pedal?
Theoretically, you could, but it took a while for it to track. So if you didn't leave enough time for the feedback to start to happen, yeah. So there was a couple of problems. One of them was that. The other problem that none of us knew till we started using it was the physics problem of when you vibrate the string from the saddle, it effectively changes the length of the string because now the endpoint becomes the back of the saddle rather than where the string goes over it, and it changes the pitch. So if you do what I was doing higher up the neck, you hear this where the string it gets longer and the pitch changes. So it was a cool idea, but you had to use a Telecaster style guitar for it, and fun to work on, didn't really become a commercial success. I want to pause here for a second. So microcontrollers were in that thing. The particular kind of microcontroller, the 8051, I learned how to program at Buchla because that's the same chip that all the Buchla modules were using. So there's this kind of, what I noticed when I was doing this presentation, this constant process where things that I learned, I end up using 2 or 3 steps down the road, and I get into those situations from people that I met before. So there's this community aspect of following what interests you and meeting people, and then somehow later, unexpectedly, they know that you're interested in this thing or know how to do this thing, and you get a job out of it, which is great when you're contracting, because one of the stresses of being self-employed is always wondering where the next job's coming from. So the bigger your network is, the more likely you are to get something out of the blue, like this, which is an electric skateboard. So a friend of mine who I had worked with at 3DO, the game company, many years before, called me up one day and said, I've been working with these guys in Santa Cruz that are building an electric skateboard, and I can't work on it anymore, and I think you'd have fun with it, so why don't you take over from me? So I started working with them on the skateboard, which was super hip at this time, 2016. I've forgotten the name of the other company that was doing it in San Francisco. I started seeing skateboards everywhere. This is just before scooters happened. And so this was using ARM chips, and we had this removable battery that nobody else had at the time, and we were getting great press. It's the Tesla of electric skateboards, and go 20 miles an hour for 10 miles or 20 miles. It was an interesting change for me because it was sports nerds and technology as opposed to music nerds and technology, which are the people that I've been hanging out with for a very long time. Kiteboarders and skateboarders and surfers. Since it was in Santa Cruz, one whole wall of the office was people's surfboards. And they'd be like, lunch, I'm going to surf. And they'd disappear for a couple of hours and come back. Really nice people, nice project. It's started to do well and then started to not do so well. And that fall is when baby happened. And as they started to ask questions like, how many paychecks could you not get paid? And I just had gotten this baby, Tenzin, and thinking maybe this is a time when I should think about the responsible path rather than the most fun path. So I quit and said, sorry, I can't skip any paychecks. And if you guys are about to go under, I need to find something else to do. And so I ended up going back to talk to Keith McMillan, and his other company, Bebop Sensors, made a fabric-based pressure sensor. He had come up with the idea when he was working on a Bode instrument where he wanted to sense pressure but on a curved surface, and all the pressure sensors at that time would only work flat. And so he came up with this idea for a fabric and they evolved it into this pretty cool, it's like carbon, like it says, carbon nanoparticles and these randomly entangled fibers that ends up being a fabric that can sense pressure. So they put it on golf clubs and on footballs and the insoles of shoes. I have some pictures of that. There we go, the insole of the shoe. They worked for a while putting the fabric in car seats. You know how when it tells you, it tries to figure out whether or not there's a person there for an airbag? So they were going to use this fabric for that. I worked on a project which ended up being, hello, I think the CIA actually did it, which was a mat that you stand on. I'll play the demo, it's got cool music. So that was really fun. It's, again, those 8051 microcontrollers that are scanning all the little points along the fabric, and you could see the outlines of your toes, and if you move back and forth, it could sense the pressure differences. I don't know what the CI did with it, if anything, but that got me started with them. And then the next project was this, which I have one of here. They were talking to Pearl USA, which is, I think, still the biggest percussion manufacturer in the world, and they make marimbas and drum kits and all that stuff, and they were trying to figure out an instrument that students could use that was less expensive and more portable than like a full giant marimba. And so over time, the mechanical and electrical engineers and the Pearl people came up with the idea of this malletSTATION, and it uses that pressure sensitive fabric. So underneath all the keys is the fabric along the controls on the right. So it's a very simple, very cheap to make, and so it's a really playable instrument for like $1,000 instead of many, many, many thousands of dollars. And that's another one that was 2 thumbs up. It was like the best-selling instrument at Pearl that year, and now they're in percussion. People can like have entire rooms of marimba students that are playing on headphones with their iPhone as the sound source. So it's a totally different world than it was before. I don't have it hooked up, but if you want to come for show and tell after and check it out, please do. I think I have also a video for this with a mallet player, which I am not. Out there. Around this time, Joe, who introduced me to the skateboard guys, called up again and said, hey, I met this guy, and he has this idea. What he wants to do is have a thing that you can plug into your phone that analyzes the music that you're listening to and then vibrates your body based on the patterns in the music. And I think that because I had basically done that already with the Lightbox, remember from years and years ago, where it analyzes music and splits it out into colors, I could reuse that whole thing and split it out into different radio channels for these little body rock things. So that was really fun. And he ended up, I think this was the final iteration where there was a belt that had the battery and the analyzer sort of box that plugged into your phone. And then he was selling these shirts that had little pockets so you could put the rocks on in different places depending on where you wanted. And it was neat because you feel like the thumpy bass part and like cymbal strikes and like melody parts would move around your body. And he tried all these different ways to market it, like when you're jogging, you can listen to music and feel it. Or then he was working with concert promoters. So what if you buy like premium tickets to the concert and you get a body rock thing for the night, and it's connected to that feed of the board of the concert, so you can literally feel the live music in your body haptically instead of just through the air.
Would that be like a Bluetooth connection? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I think specifically we used Ant. I don't know if you've heard of Ant, but it's basically like a Bluetooth derivative. And it was cool, and yet, once again, cool idea, not enough market for it, and the whole project died. But I learned a lot about Bluetooth, and I met several people who I worked with again later. Oh, here's the sexy marketing slide. Nice lights and muscly people. And so around this time, I heard again from the inboard people. They got they went on Shark Tank and got a whole bunch of press, and eventually somebody gave them a whole bunch of money, and they said, "Hey, we have a bunch of money now. Do you want to come back and work with us again?" And I said, "Okay, sure." And so then scooters were starting to happen, and the marketing and business people were looking at the comparison of electric skateboards and electric scooters and realizing that a whole lot more people wanted scooters. And so we went on this insane year-long sprint fire drill to make a scooter out of the skateboard that we could sell in time. The company was German that had funded it, and they wanted to have a scooter ready by the time the laws that allowed electric scooters on the streets in Germany went into effect. And so we worked with a company called Stell in Santa Barbara who did the industrial design, and we sort of repurposed some of the stuff from the skateboard, the battery idea and the electronics, the power stuff, the motor controller. And sad to say, we got within a few weeks of being done with it, and the business relationship between Inboard and the company in Spain who was funding it at that point, because they're kind of like Bird or Lyft or whatever, and they were playing financial chicken, and they wouldn't give us any money, and we're like, we're going to go under in like a month, but it's only going to take us 6 weeks to finish it. We had like a manufacturing line in China set up, and we were sending the parts over, and it was all ready to go. And I don't know what exactly happened, probably things behind the scenes that I wasn't above my pay grade, but they pulled out, and then the whole thing, yet again, tanked. I have one that still works, but there's only a handful that made it out into the world. But it was a really interesting project. There's Bluetooth involved. There was, syncing it to your phone. We had a cellular modem connection to the back office, because you needed to be able to, like, when you pay for your ride, it has to unlock the scooter and lock it again when you're done, and the GPS to do on your phone. And so there was all this infrastructure and software that was built to operate a fleet, which only ended up ever being about 25 of them. So that was September of 2019, and I was so burnt out that when that died, because it had gone under, I got unemployment, and I thought, I'm just going to take a few months off and do whatever I want and relax and not try to start looking for another job. Here's some of the scooter guys. Tony, who did all the motor work. Amazing skateboarder too. There's the one that I was riding out by the bay in Alameda. So I started getting into Eurorack. Like, I'd been hearing about it forever and ever. I'd been working on modular synth stuff with Don, and people kept saying, "Oh, but there's this Eurorack stuff that's so much cheaper." And so I thought, I'll get a couple. And they call it Eurocrack for a reason. So I had a couple, and then I got a couple of more, and then a couple of more, and then a lot more. And then I had a whole system. And because I was fun employed at that point, I was making a lot of music. I started a YouTube stream of like very long form generative music, of setting up patterns that could go for days or weeks. Sometimes I had some that went for 2 or 3 weeks, where every day I would go down and tweak it a little bit and listen to it for a while, or listen to it before I went to sleep and get up the next morning and tweak it some more. And it was really fun. Each new thing adds a new sound or a new pattern that you can make. And but I realized that I was still, there were things that I wanted to do over really long time scales, and I kept trying to find a module that would do it. Like I wanted to be able to have a pulse in the music that maybe you didn't even hear, but that was underlying the structure. So maybe a new part would come in on this rhythm, so it would imply a rhythm, but not actually be like a kick drum 4 on the floor sort of thing. And I wanted something that could count pulses and like be a virtual switch, turn things on and off. And I couldn't find one, and I couldn't find one. And then I heard about this thing called Daisy. These guys in Southern California, you know, to go back to the microcontroller idea, they designed a microcontroller kind of like an Arduino for audio. So it has a much beefier processor than an Arduino, and it has more memory, and it has more like many channels of high resolution audio. And fun for me, they decided we're going to make a Eurorack version of this thing that's programmable however you want. And I thought, I have an idea, and now I have a way that really easily I can stick that in my system and program it to make it do whatever I want. So I thought, I'm going to try to do it. So I got out my debug adapter and spent a week or two messing around with it, and I got it to where it did the idea. So the module, it counts pulses, and for each channel that's counting, you can say, I want the output to be high, like the switch to be on for this many beats, and then off for this many beats. And there's 4 channels of that here. You can see 1, 2, 3, and 4 going this way. And so I have a little video that I made of the first time I got it to work. So basically there's a pulse that it's counting, and there's a percussion part that comes in and out based on the count. Let's see what it sounds like. Funky module that's coming into the input. Let me see if I can. Here we go. I've got it so that for 4 beats you can hear the percussion part, and for the other 2 you can't. I'm going to stick the microphone inside the headphone. Whoa. A little dizzying. I guess it's just not loud enough. But you can see on the display it's counting, and the total is going to be 6. So at 6 it's going to start over, and then it's going to play that percussion part for 2 beats, and then play nothing for the next 4. And so I started using it, but like if you have something that's going at once per second, the numbers would go up to 99, so I could count beats over very long periods of time and have structures in the music that lasted more time than normal, like, you know, drum kit kind of thing. So, no, why does the next button keep turning the video back on? So I wanted to show you the sort of prototyping process really quick. This was the first version with the display that I got working, and then I got the knobs working, the LEDs to show the output of each channel. And I started trying to figure out what is it going to look like, and how, you know, what things to put on the panel, because there's sort of an infinite number of options of things that you can try. So I ended up settling on this. My friend who worked on the Body Rocks project, Chuck, was an electrical engineer, and I said, I have this idea. Will you help me make a board? Because I don't know how to do it. And he said, sure. So we made the electronics, and then I had a panel made. There's a company, Front Panel Express, that will do it very fast, but it also costs like $80. And I thought, if I'm going to keep prototyping this, that's way too expensive. So I bought a computer-controlled router and started prototyping my own panels, learning to cut wood and aluminum, which was really fun. And then I ended up finally with something that I could use that helped me with the idea of how is it going to work. And it was just sort of fun to do something. Engraving. That was the one with labels. So you can see different iterations. So that's the final one that I ended up having 50 of them made. So to try to see if I could get other people interested. I figured I spent all this time on it, and probably if I had this idea, then somebody else would want something like this too. And I have it here. We don't have very much. Oh, we're already out of time. So let me blast through the last bit. So, what happened in this story? So I was working on this project thinking, okay, next month I'm going to start looking for a job, and maybe next month I'll start looking for a job. And then in March, the pandemic happened, and school closed, so my kid was at home, and we were having to take care of him 24/7. And so basically, I just stayed home the rest of the year, and started to think, by the end of the next year, he was back in daycare. I need to do something. And I started interviewing. Like, I was interviewing books, and I interviewed at Google, which didn't go that well. I didn't really want to be there anyway, I don't think. But the stars aligned, and I got this job at Cruise, and so that's where I am now. Robot taxis, just trying to stuff a supercomputer into the trunk of a car and make it drive itself. At first, it doesn't seem necessarily audio related, but it's using microcontrollers and embedded Linux that I worked on before, audio. One of the things that I'm doing for the next generation of the car is the audio routing inside of the car. So there's this thing called A2B, Automotive Audio Bus, and it's like the radio, and if you're going to make phone calls from inside the car and audio from video, all going between the modules inside the car, I worked on that. And I'm still there now. We've got cars in San Francisco now out every night doing paid rides, so you can do like an Uber ride with a computer if you want. It's pretty amazing, just in the 2 years that I've been there, seeing how it's gone from testing and kind of working to now, like, questions of how do we make it drive like a San Francisco driver, so people here know what to expect when they see one, as opposed to Dubai or Tokyo, where you have to make the car drive in the vernacular of the place so that people don't run into it, or less likely to run into it. And I think that's it for now. Do I have questions? Thanks.
I was wondering, the light prism that you made that refracts light when you play music. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
How exactly does that? I mean, how does it work? Like, how does music translate to different light patterns and so on, like that?
I thought about that a lot and tried to figure. There's an idea called a color organ that's very old. People have been trying to do it forever. There's different ways of like using filters, but what it all comes down to is like you've got the audio spectrum, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz that humans can hear. So basically what they all do is in some way divide it up into pieces and assign that piece to a color. And so what I did to prototype it was make a max patch that does, you guys know about FFTs, fast Fourier transform, where you can analyze audio and then decompose it into chunks. So I could say from 20 hertz to 40 hertz is going to be red, and from 40 to 60 is going to be orange, and from 60 to 200 is going to be yellow. And then I listened to a lot of music through it and played with those numbers and looked at what it was doing, and eventually found like bins that was where you could sort of see the orchestration. Like the kick drum is in the red, and then the bass part is just above that. And when someone hits a cymbal, you get white and purple. And it turned out to work really well. It's just a lot of tuning once the basic idea was going.
Cool.
Is that programmable?
Which?
So what you're talking about is dividing the audio spectrum.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah,
then, and then according to where you are, using a different color. So is that programmable?
It is, yeah. That was the
Great. Because Scriabin, Alexander Scriabin, when, towards the end of his life, he actually wrote a piece that was for orchestra and light.
Oh, wow.
So it's not very well known, but it would be an interesting thing to actually take his mapping and do it on your crystals.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying. Yeah. So can you get those things?
You can still buy them,
crystals?
yeah. If you look online, seedcrystals.com, or just search for Light Labyrinth,
Oh, okay.
you'll find Kirby's website.
Super. Thanks.
Yeah. The boxes themselves are not so expensive, but those giant crystals are pretty.
So what are you using the transforms for?
The FFT,
Yeah.
that's what turns the audio, the live audio, into the power measurements of how bright the light should be.
Oh, for brightness. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you were in college, did you like have to take all these science and like math-based classes to understand the level of like software engineering?
Absolutely not. One of the reasons I went to Evergreen is because I was selfish and wanted to avoid things that I didn't want to study, and so I didn't take any math, which I sort of regret. But that's the thing about teams, right? When I said I interviewed at Silicon Graphics back in the day, I think I talked to 5 people, and all of them were mathematicians, and they didn't hire me because I didn't have a math degree. And I'm like, but you got 5 people with math degrees. What if you had somebody that knows something else, right? And so if you know people that know that stuff and you have a question, be like, I have a complicated math problem, solve it. And then I knew enough that I could apply it, but I took a few programming courses, but mostly it was my own experimenting and playing around and reading online. Now you can go on the web. When I was at Evergreen, at Mills, it just started, the web started to happen. But if I had a question, I'd have to write it on paper and mail it to somebody and wait. Like you couldn't go on
Email.
the web and Google and find the answer to your problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just was wondering, the pressure-sensitive cloth that you were working on, did you ever like experiment with other instruments like piano or?
They sell those, yeah. KMI, I don't have it up here, but KMI has keyboard controllers. There's little ones. There's some big ones that that are location sensitive, so you can press a note and slide your finger and bend back and forth.
Like vibrato and stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Keyboard and Keyboard Pro, and there's several. So that was a big use for it was, yeah, I should have put pictures. They've got also some kind of DJ-like controllers with a lot of pads or percussion kind of pad things that are all based on the same thing. The plastic tops like this and then the fabric underneath.
Cool.
Yeah, they're in Berkeley.
This is just, I'm just curious, we all have to make choices in our life, but if you had a choice to do anything a little differently, would you do it a little differently, or would you?
If I had 2020 hindsight
Yeah,
now,
I
well, I would
mean-
not have sold all that Apple stock, that's for damn sure.
Yeah, of course.
But I think, when I was making this and thinking about how I got from place to place, I don't think so. I mean, I never had a plan. It wasn't like, your parents are like, what's your plan? And what kind of degree are you going to get? And what are you going to do? And I had no idea. I just knew what I was interested in. And that if I got good enough at it, I could probably make some kind of living at it. And to follow my gut feeling about things and people.
That's a good way to go, because if you hadn't followed your dreams and hadn't followed what you wanted to do, you wouldn't have been as happy. You would have been doing something you weren't happy with.
Exactly. And I found that's why I was willing to try things like that writing job. I didn't know if I would like writing or not, but I went for it. Or, what do I want to say about that? It's interesting.
Is there anything else now? It's 2020. Now, what do you think is in your future?
I have no idea. And that's the thing about the alchemy of, every decade maybe the ingredients of what you want from your career and your art life, they're all changing. Now that I have a family and a house and, before when a company would go under, I'd be like, whatever, my rent is $200 a month or something like back in the day. I'll go on a trip. I'll study something new. I'm still trying to figure out how the alchemy of this decade, how do I think about retirement now? How am I going to, I don't have a pension because I didn't work at the same company for 40 years like my cousin did or whatever, or one of my teachers, or like Chris is staying, stability, there's something about stability, but I was never that kind of person. And so I've kind of jumped from thing to thing and hoped that the next gig, the next project would take me to another place. So I'm at Cruise now. Not sure where it's going. It seems like it's going to be successful based on the way the world is working, but anything can happen.
I also was an independent contractor, and one of the important things is keeping your database open. You've said that, several times people from the past have called you. How did you make sure that everybody remembered what you did? And
I didn't. I never thought about it. I noticed it after the fact. Like when oh yeah, this person that I was friends with or that I met, they just kept returning this interesting, like, sort of fractal, to go back to the, the chaos theory thing. there's some kind of web, like the bigger your social network, it seems like the more, I wasn't trying to do it on purpose. Like I didn't think I'm going to go to this event and network. But what I noticed over time is that after I'd had a bunch of different jobs, I knew so many different people that I was always hearing about something that might be fun to go do. And so it gave me options that I didn't create necessarily. Silicon Valley and the Bay Area is pretty small. So being nice to people and doing a good job, it goes a long way. Any more questions?
Do you use any like DAWs, like FL Studio, Logic?
I do
GarageBand?
use Logic sometimes. I played around with Reaper and what else? Digital Performer, though I kind of given up on them. It's gotten so flaky. But mostly, one of the reasons I got into doing music this way is because on my day job I was staring at the screen and I didn't want to have a computer involved in my music world. And so it's still electricity and wires, but it's not like pointing a mouse at things on the screen. And I like the physical part of doing music this way. Sometimes when I get a thing that I like, I'll go back to the DAW and record it and maybe do something, process it in some way or use it later. But I haven't really been like making pieces in a DAW.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that your commercial projects ever inspire you or influence the things you're doing with your art, or vice versa?
I definitely felt like in putting this slideshow together that the kind of music that I like to make is structured the same way this 40 years is structured, which is I set up some conditions and then wait for serendipity or something to like I want it to surprise me. I don't want to figure it out ahead of time and write it all down. And I didn't want to have a plan of this is where I want to be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. So that thing I noticed. The other direction, sometimes the thing that I was working on at work, some technology, if I had a musical idea, I realized that, oh, I could use that for that thing. Like, you know, the microcontroller stuff, I ended up making these modules because I knew how to program microcontrollers as much as anything. So there's definitely a feedback or a conversation between those things. Where I'd have a job for a while and then work on my own projects for a while, and they relate.
Anybody else? Question?
Would you say, I know you said that you mainly like worked for other companies. Was it mainly because you didn't want to start your own thing? I know you did the Apple thing, but were you like scared that if you tried something else, it would fall through, just like your other works?
Not really. I mean, I sort of thought of myself when I was a contractor as having started my own company in a way, like I was just my own self-employed person, and I didn't have health insurance, and I had to, you know, do the business part of finding gigs and stuff. The time that I've come closest to thinking about starting a company is when I made this Eurorack module and thought I could make more of these. Now is a really bad time because of the pandemic and the whole parts crisis, and a lot of these little companies are going under because they have these designs and they can't get the spare parts to make them. But what I thought about when I thought about that is, do I really want to be a business person? Mm-hmm. Do I want to answer the phone, and do I want to have, you know, a business bank account and deal with how supply chains, and I like making the stuff, the prototyping and the excitement of the idea and trying to bring your idea into reality. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I would make a very good business person, so I'm kind of waiting. I think about it periodically, but the right combination of factors and people just hasn't come together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Hey, so I have a question about the body rocks that you made. So, how likely do you think it is for us to create these like full body like suits that you could wear for like gaming or like you know what you were saying about haptic feedback, and they just started to do that, I know, for the PS5, and so like how likely it is for like to have full body suits that you can wear to a concert or play games in, like VR games in and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. I think it's super likely. I think AR and VR is going to drive that because all these companies are coming up with these new immersive environments, right? And they've got to come up with other sensory angles. And I think some version of that, whether it's a full body thing or some way to fool your skin or, you know, vibrate your body in different ways is absolutely going to happen.
And yeah, do you think like haptic feedback would be the way to do that, or Bluetooth, or some other kind of system that connects to the game, or somehow? How would you? Yeah.
I think haptics, I guess, as a big concept of generating some kind of sensory information from the game that's going on. There's lots of different things like Bluetooth or USB or Wi-Fi or all the different ways of communicating. And the latency is really important. It has to happen close enough in time to what your eyes are seeing, or it gets really weird.
Yeah. Cool.
There's a lot of those full body table things, like you go lay on a, like Sonic, I forget what they call them now, like Sonic massage, where you lay on a massage table and there's giant speakers built into it and it kind of vibrates your organs. I haven't done it, but I've heard about it.
So, being in your particular, well, I guess, section of the electronic world, I think that you're very much kind of like seeing a lot of the development of like the cutting edge of what sort of, well, the direction that electronic development for consumer products kind of like takes. But I think that there's also like a lot of things that, you know, were just mentioned, like, you know, VR and AR stuff, that maybe are not always in those fields, but may run kind of adjacent. I guess actually before I ask this, I'm curious about like the thing you were working on. Like you were working on it for Eurorack, right? And how old is like Eurorack? Is like a, you know,
90s.
Okay. So I guess I'm curious about how, in your own kind of like artistic exploration and sort of like seeing the development of this technology, what kind of like emerging electronics do you feel are like the most inspiring, or maybe have like the most potential for areas you would want to explore going forward?
Wow, that's a big question. I haven't seen anything new. I guess in some ways I've been looking backwards, because I'm working with stuff that's from the 60s, kind of. Like the concept is from the 60s. But I really like the physicality of the interface. It's not like playing an instrument the way you play guitar or play drums, but your body's involved in a way that touching things under glass is not. I'm curious, to kind of go back to the previous question, what's going to happen with this in the VR world, where, you know, can you paint light and sound with your hands, you know, in a very, like the Lightning controller had this percussion thing.
Right. I was actually thinking just about that.
And I remember reading like when I was a teenager, science fiction stories about like prodigy children that they would keep away from society and hide in a room and give them to see what kind of art they would create without any input from other people. And one of the instruments was this thing where you could do light and sound together with gesture. So I think there's this interesting transformation that's happening, that's been happening for a while in music, like where people are doing DJ stuff or doing Eurorack stuff. They're not playing traditional instruments, but they're generating music. And so the technology, you know, I guess I'm going to quote Brian Eno, it's substituting judgment for skill, not spending decades and decades becoming a virtuosic instrumentalist, but being able to make music with technology much more quickly. I think what's happening now with visual art, like with these new things where you can describe, I want to see a banana riding a skateboard through San Francisco in the snow, and just by typing it out, the computer generates that image, and then artists get upset because you didn't paint it, but you thought of it, and you looked at the result and decided that you liked it. So is that not being an artist, or is it? And maybe, you know, with these VR kinds of environments, somebody's going to have to program the virtual instrument. And so what choices do they give you? Like, I remember when I was working at 3DO, somebody came in with a guitar where you couldn't play a wrong note. And like, well, what does that even mean? Like,
right. So like a normal guitar, basically.
Yeah. What's the wrong? You can't play out of the scale, or you can't bend the strings, but what if that's part of what you like? So they've artificially limited your possibilities to try to make it so that it always sounds good.
Right.
So I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that it will be interesting to see what happens with as like, your phone now is faster than the entire room full of computers was 10 years ago, and that keeps happening and keeps happening and keeps happening. What instruments are going to be like when you can synthesize convincingly entire orchestra and fireworks displays just by moving your hands around? What kind of art people will create with it? I'm still more interested in this right now.
Yeah.
It seems like from your job history, like you've done a lot of creating and innovating, and I assume that comes with a lot of risk of like success and failure. Have you like struggled with like that kind of instability, and like how do you deal with that if you have, and any advice in like when we're kind of deciding how we want to set our path for our careers?
I think it's good to be part of failures and successes and see how it happens. My kind of rule of thumb from when I was contracting is that I worked at a job long enough to have a cushion in the bank of about 6 or 9 months. So if something died, I wasn't like broke and have to move out of my house immediately. So I think if you want to pursue being self-employed and like make riskier job choices, like things that it's not like working for IBM or for Microsoft where no matter what happens for decades, you're going to have a job. Thinking about your overhead and how much money you have in the bank for a rainy day if the company tanks unexpectedly. When I was younger, I didn't really worry about it that much. I think it would be a lot harder for me to make that choice now. But you guys are starting out, and you can live in a shared house with 6 people and have a lot more sort of life options than like me with a kid and a family and a mortgage and all that stuff. So I think tuning your risk tolerance to this time of your life and to your personality. I know some people get stressed out constantly about not knowing what the next job is going to be. So I think it's some self-reflection and knowing what you like and what you can tolerate. I didn't worry about it much, but I had friends who were like, how could you quit your job now in 2007 or whenever that recession was? But something in me was like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I feel like I have some trust that something will come. I know enough people and there's so much stuff going on that the next gig will come. And that was comfortable for me, but it might not be for you.
So then that like confidence from like your experience with others and having that network kind of in your back pocket, did that confidence come like as the years went and you had that network built up?
And partly from seeing other people. Like I worked with people at jobs who had been self-employed before and were talking to me about why they decided to take a job versus staying self-employed. And I figured if at some point I was like, if they can do it, maybe I can do it. The worst that can happen is it will fail and I'll have to go get a job at Microsoft or something. Like I felt like I could do that, so that was my back pocket or whatever in a way. But I fortunately haven't really had to do that. Something interesting has come along every time.
Cool.
Thank you. So I think it might be nice, I would love to hear what you've got going on there. You
Okay.
brought that all the way from the East Coast.
You do it. Yeah, if people
And then maybe if people had other questions, you could feel free to come up and Darren can stay for a little bit to talk to people. Does that
Okay.
sound good?
Yeah, you can also come up and see. It's hard to kind of even tell what I'm doing from out there if you want to look.
Okay.
But basically what I brought was the clock watcher module and a couple of things that make sound and to play around with percussion parts, because one of the things you can do with it is generate pulses that are percussion-like rather than automated mixing or whatever.
moment to thank all of you again for coming this afternoon and to thank Darren Gibbs for being here.